Here's the thing. You can learn a lot about a civilization by how and where it pooped. Forget golden thrones and military conquests. The real secrets of daily life are etched into stone latrines, reeking cesspits, and communal wipe stations that doubled as accidental plague incubators. That marble bust of Caesar? Sure, impressive. But have you seen his public restroom policies? Beneath every empire lies a sewer system, and trust me, some were more literal than metaphorical. So grab your sponge on a stick and get comfy, because tonight we're plunging into humanity's most revealing porcelain past. If this already smells like your kind of history, go ahead and tap that subscribe button. It's cleaner than anything you'll find in a Roman public latrine. There's something oddly comforting about the idea that the first thing humanity figured out, before the wheel, before written language, before we even agreed whether meat should be raw or roasted, was where to go when nature knocked. Not what to eat, not how to hunt. No, what we prioritized apparently was how not to trip over our own waste. Humanity's first great infrastructure project, a bathroom. Let that sink in, along with the rest of it. Our story begins in the ancient city of Harappa, in the Indus Valley, around 200 and 500 BCE, a place that frankly makes modern urban planning look like a toddler's Lego tantrum. Here people lived in neatly aligned homes made of kiln-fired bricks, with actual drainage systems connected to their private bathrooms. Yes, private, as in toilets inside the home. Meanwhile, in parts of 21st century New York, good luck finding a clean public stall without downloading a toilet locating app. One archaeologist, trowel in hand, and probably smelling like sunburn and historic dust, unearthed one of these Harappan wonders. A small, raised platform with a hole, a slope, and a connection to brace yourself. An actual sewage channel. It drained away the contents like a polite, ancient whisper saying, "Thank you, please never speak of this again." All of it hidden beneath the streets, like an underground conspiracy of cleanliness. Now imagine the archaeologist's face. They probably expected pottery shards, maybe a bone comb. Instead, a 4,000-year-old toilet, smugly intact, like it had been waiting millennia to judge modern plumbing choices. These weren't isolated luxuries either. Roughly 700 sites across the Indus Valley have shown similar bathroom designs, which raises an awkward question. How did a Bronze Age civilization, without Wi-Fi, power tools, or a single how-to YouTube video, manage to create sewage systems that, and I say this gently, outperform half of America's rural infrastructure? Here's the short answer. They took waste seriously, like sacred seriously. See, for the Harappans, cleanliness wasn't just hygiene, it was ritual. Bathing platforms were often centrally located in homes, not tucked away like guilty secrets. Waste removal wasn't shameful, it was smart. Every toilet was connected to a sloped pipe or brick-lined drain, which then connected to a larger citywide system. This wasn't just advanced, it was coordinated, communal, and astonishingly forward-thinking. Now compare that to modern apartment buildings with updated kitchens and open-concept layouts, but pipes that groan like a Victorian ghost every time you flush. Some 4,000 years later, and we still haven't nailed down how to poop without drama. And what happened to the Harappans? Why don't we see their descendants bragging about their ancient plumbing on TikTok? Well, that's the kicker. Despite all this progress, or maybe because of it, the Indus Valley civilization quietly vanished around. Scholars debate the cause. Climate change, shifting rivers, invasions, over-urbanization. But here's a weirdly poetic theory. Some suggest their sophisticated infrastructure may have made them too dependent on systems they couldn't sustain. So yes, it's possible that a civilization that mastered sewers before horses may have quite literally flushed itself out of history. Now that's an exit strategy. There's something humbling about that, isn't there? The idea that sanitation, this very boring, very unglamorous thing, might be both the foundation and the downfall of a great culture. We love to write history in battles and crowns, but maybe, just maybe, it's the humble toilet that tells the real story. And look, the Harappans weren't perfect. Their writing system remains undeciphered. Their cities were eerily standardized, like some kind of ancient HOA nightmare. But they nailed the whole not living in your own filth thing, which is more than we can say for medieval Europe. Don't worry, we'll get to that mess later. There's a strange kind of intimacy in studying ancient toilets. Think about it. Every person who sat on that ceramic ledge, every child crouched over a drain, Every elder who poured water down those channels, they were real, they were human, they had routines, stomach bugs, and probably a few disastrous curry nights. And in their most vulnerable, most unspoken moments, they left behind clues. Not in gold, in grime. It's not the kind of thing you see in a museum gift shop. World's oldest toilet. Now in scented candle form. But maybe it should be. Maybe if we honored sewage systems the way we do swords and sarcophagi, we'd stop pretending hygiene is some modern invention. So yeah, next time your toilet overflows, or your landlord ignores the rattling pipe behind your shower, just remember, the Indus Valley figured this out 4,000 years ago, with bricks, gravity, and a better sense of civic responsibility than most city councils today. And if you're still not impressed, just wait. This was the beginning. There are entire empires built on questionable bathroom etiquette. So hold on to your bidet, because this journey's just begun. Let's take a scenic trip to ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, gods with falcon heads, and the world's earliest passive-aggressive HOA rules. You'd think a civilization capable of aligning 2.3 million stone blocks with mathematical precision might have figured out how to install a decent toilet, but alas, the same people who buried pharaohs with chariots and golden toothbrushes often relieved themselves in holes in the ground, or worse, in decorative jars. Welcome to the Egyptian wipe down, a tale of elegance, hierarchy, and deeply uncomfortable wiping materials. Picture this. You're a peasant, living along the Nile, in a 2-room mud brick home. Your morning routine? Not exactly spa-like. You shuffle out behind your house to a small pit, probably dug with little ceremony, and do your business with whatever's nearby. Sand, leaves, the emotional weight of being born into the wrong dynasty. Sanitation, at this level, was rudimentary. But hey, the view of the river was great. Now let's shift the camera to the elite. Say, a high-ranking priest or a scribe who kisses up to one. Their bathroom situation? Slightly improved, if you consider a decorated clay pot in the corner of a bedroom a luxury, sometimes lined with sand, sometimes just ceramic, always awkward. And wiping? Oh, you sweet summer child. Toilet paper had not been invented, and the alternatives ranged from mildly abrasive to absolute war crime. Popular choices included smooth stones, bundled reeds, and the pièce de résistance, ostraka shards of broken pottery. That's right, ancient Egyptians recycled their old jars by using them to wipe. Sustainability sure, comfort debatable. Now let's talk royal plumbing. You're probably thinking, surely the pharaohs had some gold-trimmed, lotus-scented lavatories with harp music and incense, right? Well, kind of. They certainly had better setups. Some tombs and palace ruins show signs of limestone toilet platforms. These were sometimes placed over pits, which may or may not have been cleaned out by an unfortunate slave whose job title has been mercifully lost to time. The wealthiest households even had rudimentary drainage systems, gravity-fed water channels that whisked away waste like a gentle goodbye. But even in these high-status homes, bathing and toileting often shared space with ritual, and ritual meant incense. Lots of incense. Not because it was pleasant, but because, well, you try masking the smell of communal living in 1110 Bifid with only myrrh and blind optimism. In fact, ancient Egyptian culture was obsessed with cleanliness, but mostly the kind visible to the gods. Being physically clean was associated with being spiritually pure. Priests shaved their bodies daily and bathed several times a day. They anointed themselves with oils, and some had private washing areas. Yet even these rituals coexisted with a fairly underwhelming understanding of how to get rid of waste. The contradiction is oddly human. Sparkling surface, muddy underbelly. And here's where it gets weirder. Some scholars believe toilets may have played a role in magic. Certain toilet-related spells were found in medical papyri to prevent diseases, exorcise demons, or treat anxieties of the belly, which is academic speak for explosive regret. They believed that waste was spiritually potent. After all, if something leaves your body, maybe a spirit could sneak in through the exit. So to recap, the pharaoh might have had a limestone seat, the scribe got a jar and a prayer, and the farmer, he got a breeze and a rock. Sanitation was stratified, just like the society, a pyramid of poop privilege, if you will. But here's the twist. Despite the lack of high-tech toilets, The Egyptians did understand the importance of keeping water clean. Archaeological digs have revealed drainage canals in larger cities. Tomb paintings show servants pouring water over their masters' hands and feet, and even the humblest homes often had small basins for washing. Waste might not have been properly flushed, but it wasn't entirely ignored. Hygiene, at least in public life, was respected, even venerated. Still, I have questions. Like, how do you build a mathematically perfect pyramid, but forget to add indoor plumbing? Were they just too distracted measuring Orion's belt to realize their own needed a rinse? Would you be honest, trade modern 2-ply toilet paper for a decorated shard of ancient dinnerware? Sure, it's got history. But does it spark joy? Let's not judge too harshly though. After all, most of us wouldn't fare well under the conditions of 2000 BCE Egypt. The heat, the sand, the ever-present threat of dysentery and a poorly angled ostracron. We at least have learned the sacred truth of wet wipes and bidets. They had perfume, sunburns and strong thighs from squatting. And yet, despite it all, they built a society that lasted over 3,000 years. A civilization that mapped the stars, embalmed the dead, and invented eyeliner that could double as bug repellent. They just never cracked the comfort of a decent bathroom break. So next time you're lighting a candle in your modern, flushable, climate-controlled bathroom, think of the ancient Egyptians. They lived their entire lives under the gaze of divine judgment, and still had to risk pottery shards where the sun doesn't shine. History isn't always built on grandeur. Sometimes it's built on discomfort, awkward squatting, and incense that just isn't doing the job. Ancient Greece. Birthplace of democracy, philosophy, drama, and collective bowel movements. For all its genius in laying the intellectual groundwork of the Western world, Greece had a truly perplexing blind spot when it came to modesty, and nowhere is this more hilariously and horrifyingly clear than in their bathrooms, or more accurately, their lack of them. Picture a white marble city gleaming in the sun, filled with toga-clad philosophers, sculptors chiseling abs into stone, and olive oil practically flowing in the streets. Now, mentally place a row of stone toilet benches right in the middle of all that majesty. No stalls, no dividers, just a line of communal holes, side by side, like a company meeting gone horribly off the rails. You didn't get privacy in ancient Greek bathrooms? You got conversation, or worse, eye contact. To the modern mind, this is troubling. Even the most extroverted among us draw the line at communal squatting. But in Athens or Corinth, that was just Tuesday. The Greeks believed in communal everything: bathing, eating, philosophy, war. Why should defecation be any different? If anything, it was another chance to share ideas and bodily functions in equal measure. Because when you're solving the mysteries of existence, who cares if someone's thighs are brushing yours? These public latrines were essentially stone benches with keyhole-shaped openings carved into them. Underneath ran a shallow drainage channel, usually flushed with water diverted from nearby aqueducts or fountains. The idea was to keep things moving, literally and socially. Sometimes there'd be a sponge on a stick for communal use. Yes, you heard that right, one sponge. Many posteriors, rinsed, supposedly, between uses. Supposedly. It's the kind of detail that makes you retroactively question all of Plato's logic. Speaking of which, let's talk about the philosophers. Were they philosophizing on the pot? Probably. Imagine Socrates, beard dangling dangerously close to the communal trough, arguing with Glaucon about justice while trying not to make a splash. There's no hard evidence that Greek intellectuals held their debates mid-squat, but there's also nothing ruling it out. And in a society that turned everything into a public forum, why not the latrine? Let that sink in. Or don't. Now, if you're wondering whether this was a purely male activity, the answer is complicated. Gender segregation in ancient Greek society was rigid, but sanitation was an odd grey area. Some bathhouses and latrines were designated for women, particularly in larger cities, but for the most part, sanitation infrastructure was built with men, and only men, in mind, which means women were often left with makeshift alternatives, like chamber pots or secluded courtyards. Elegant? No. Practical? Barely. Of course, not everyone pooped like a philosopher. The rural poor didn't have access to marble benches and running water. Their facilities were usually outdoor pits or designated corners of the house, often emptied manually. So while Athenian elites enjoyed their social lavatories, Farmers were out back squatting near their goats, hoping for a breeze and a little dignity. Still, sanitation wasn't entirely neglected. The Greeks understood the importance of waste disposal, especially when it came to public health. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of underground sewers, drainage channels, and rudimentary plumbing in urban centers. They even had laws regulating waste dumping, because apparently, even in ancient Athens, people needed to be told not to toss a chamber pot onto the agora. But again, cleanliness was seen more as a civic virtue than a personal one. The emphasis wasn't on individual comfort, it was on communal responsibility, which, while noble, doesn't make the shared sponge any less horrifying. Modern comparisons? Picture your office break room. Now remove the coffee machine, install a row of toilet seats, and require everyone to use them at the same time while discussing quarterly metrics. That's roughly the vibe of an ancient Greek bathroom. And yet, for all its awkward intimacy, this communal approach says something profound, and honestly a little touching about the Greek worldview. They saw themselves as part of a collective. Identity wasn't private, it was relational. Your existence was defined by your participation in society, even if that meant participating with your pants around your ankles. There's something almost comforting in that kind of radical transparency. No secrets, no shame, just humans being humans, with all the mess that entails. Still, you have to wonder, did Aristotle ever struggle with a bad wipe? Did the great tragedians ever write odes to post-latrine regret? Did some poor apprentice ever break the communal sponge and flee the city in disgrace? We'll never know. But one thing's certain, for all their brilliance, the Greeks weren't above a little shared indignity, and maybe that's why we still study them. Not because they were perfect, but because they embraced imperfection, even in the lavatory. So the next time you're annoyed that your office stall door doesn't reach the floor, remember, at least you're not locking philosophical eyes with Socrates mid-squat. Because ancient Greece may have invented logic, but they forgot the one thing every modern introvert knows by heart. Some things are better done alone. If Greece was the awkward teenage phase of ancient sanitation, all ideals and no dividers, then Rome was the adult who took public defecation, gave it structure, gave it flair, and somehow made it feel like a team sport. Because while Rome gave the world aqueducts, roads and Caesar salads, sort of, its real legacy might just be this: nobody pooped together more efficiently. Let's set the scene. You're walking through a bustling Roman city, maybe Pompeii before the whole volcanic incident. The streets are alive with carts, merchants yelling about olives, and children throwing questionable things at statues. You round a corner and enter a stone structure. Inside, a long bench, marble or concrete, perforated with evenly spaced holes. Beneath it, a gently flowing stream of water. Welcome to the Roman public latrine, where your dignity goes to die, but your bowels find peace. The first thing you notice: no doors, no partitions, just a parade of exposed knees and downward gazes. These weren't just toilets. They were social hubs. People gossiped, discussed politics, maybe finalized a business deal or two. And while that sounds horrifying to modern ears, the Romans were unbothered. Privacy was a foreign concept. Community, however, that was divine. And yes, the infamous sponge on a stick was real. Known as the tersorium, it was soaked in water or vinegar, and shared by everyone. Housed in a channel running along the base of the bench, the sponge was dipped, wiped, rinsed, and repeated. A cycle of optimism that makes modern gym towels look sanitary. Let that image really settle in. Take a moment. Breathe that in. Metaphorically, please. This wasn't some occasional roadside contraption either. Rome built latrines everywhere. In forums, bathhouses, temples, military camps. In the city of Ostia, archaeologists found a latrine with 20 seats arranged in a giant U, like an ancient boardroom of digestive equality. Can you imagine your Monday meeting taking place there? All in favor of the motion, and please, pass the vinegar. But Roman sanitation wasn't just about group bonding and shared sponges. It was also about engineering brilliance. They constructed vast sewer systems, the most famous being the Cloaca Maxima, which, fun fact, translates to the greatest sewer. And you know what? It earned the title. Built originally in the 6th century BCE, it drained Rome's filth straight into the Tiber. Efficient, effective, and still better than whatever your city's Department of Sanitation is pretending to fix right now. Rome understood that a clean city was a healthy city, and a powerful one. Waste disposal was an act of empire. Soldiers built latrines in remote outposts. Governors oversaw plumbing projects with the same zeal as aqueducts or amphitheatres. This was toilet diplomacy at its finest. Still, not everyone got to enjoy the imperial flush. The wealthier classes had private facilities, or at least semi-private, tucked away near kitchens or under staircases. Their toilets were sometimes decorated with mosaic floors or poetic inscriptions, because if you're going to contemplate life's mysteries while squatting, you may as well do it surrounded by art. Meanwhile, the lower classes, communal latrines or chamber pots if they were lucky, and if they weren't, well, the street was right there. Slaves were often tasked with emptying waste buckets, earning the unenviable job title of full ones, or in more accurate terms, human Roombas with worse pay and more judgment. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Romans believed in cleanliness, just not how we define it. Bathing was a daily ritual. They perfumed their hair, scrubbed their skin, and spent hours in steamy marble bathhouses. But despite their obsession with bodily hygiene, they didn't fully grasp germ theory. So while they thought nothing of sharing a sponge or lounging beside a friend mid-defecation, they also believed disease came from bad air, not the reek of the latrine you just shared with 10 senators and a goat. And still, their system worked. For centuries, even when the empire began to crumble, the latrines remained. Quiet, functional, sitting in ruins today like stone ghosts of conversations long flushed away. Modern cities could learn something here. Not about sponge logistics, God no, but about investing in sanitation like it matters. Because it does. Rome didn't become an empire just because of its military might. It became an empire because it built roads and aqueducts and sewers that made life bearable for the masses. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Like, sub, and maybe light a candle in case the sponge makes a comeback. You've earned it. So here's a thought to leave you with. The next time you're in a modern public bathroom with weird music, cracked tiles, and a hand dryer that just wheezes at you, remember Rome. They gave us wine, law, and roads. But most importantly, they made going to the bathroom a civic duty. If Roman sanitation was a triumph of pipes, marble, and sponge-sharing optimism, the centuries that followed were like yanking the flush chain of civilization, only to find it had snapped clean off. The fall of Rome didn't just send emperors packing, it sent indoor plumbing on an extended vacation. And what filled the void? Chamber pots. Human filth, and a charming new trend, throwing your waste out the window, and pretending gravity would sort it out. Welcome to the Dark Ages, where the lighting was dim, the literacy was scarce, and the bathrooms were definitely outside. Let's start in a typical medieval town. Narrow streets, timber-framed houses, leaning over like they've had one too many pints, and the unmistakable aroma of everything humans produce when they're not inventing sewer systems. In some cities, the streets were so clogged with waste that pedestrians developed what can only be described as a permanent duck-and-dodge gait. It was like a disgusting version of hopscotch, except instead of avoiding cracks, you were dodging steaming piles of someone else's dignity. Now, it's not that medieval people were trying to live in squalor, they just lacked infrastructure and any consistent understanding of what caused disease. Sure, some towns had laws against tossing chamber pots into the street, but these were about as effective as yelling at a pigeon to stop pooping on your statue. People did it anyway. They shouted "Gardez-vous," a charming French loanword meaning "look out below," and then dumped whatever horrors had been stewing in their pots onto the unsuspecting cobblestones below. Imagine walking through town and hearing that call. A split second to react, too slow, and your day and outfit were ruined. And then there were the castles. Ah yes, medieval castles. Majestic stone fortresses of noble lineage, with built-in poop chutes. These were called garderodes, a deceivingly elegant name for what was essentially a small room hanging precariously over a moat or ditch. You'd enter, sit on a wooden bench with a hole, and let gravity do the rest. If you were lucky, it dropped straight into the moat. If you were really lucky, you didn't get splashed. It was, technically, indoor plumbing, in the same way that yelling into a well is a form of communication. And don't forget the peasants. Their version of sanitation involved bushes, ditches, or a designated waste heap, which in some cases was the kitchen garden. Yes, that's right. Human fertilizer. It was the ultimate closed-loop system, disgusting, efficient, And probably why your medieval stew tasted funny. By the 14th century, some cities did try to clean up their act. London built public latrines over the Thames. Paris hired full-time waste removers, known charmingly as rakers. But these solutions were sporadic and often too little, too late. Disease was a constant threat, made worse by the fact that nobody washed their hands. And soap was basically witchcraft. When the Black Death hit in 1347, it tore through Europe like a flaming cart full of rats. Helped along by crowded cities, poor ventilation, and streets full of unmentionables. Could one cesspit spark a plague? Well, almost. There's the famous case of the Erfurt latrine disaster of 1804. Yes, that's a real sentence. During a royal gathering in a cathedral, a large number of nobles stood on a wooden floor above a cesspit. The floor collapsed. Dozens of knights and lords plunged into the waste below and drowned in poop. Let that sink in. They died, not in battle, but in a literal sea of excrement. Somewhere, a bard surely wrote a song about it. A very quiet, embarrassed song. This in many ways sums up the medieval sanitation ethos. Precariously balanced and deeply unaware of what could go wrong. And yet, in the quiet corners of monasteries and outposts, a few holdouts kept the Roman dream alive. Cloisters had rudimentary drainage. Some abbeys used diverted water to flush latrines. These were rare glimmers of hope, oases of logic in a sea of rot. But for the average person, sanitation meant try not to step in it. So how did people survive? Short answer, many didn't. Life expectancy hovered around 30-40 years, and dysentery, cholera, and plain old filth were frequent culprits. But people adapted. They carried pomanders, scented balls of herbs to mask the smell. They burned incense and wore scented gloves. Anything to cope with a world that constantly stank. It's easy to laugh, and we will, don't worry. But there's also a quiet, dark beauty to it. Humans, even when surrounded by mud and misery, still built cathedrals. They still made music, fell in love, wrote poetry. They just also did their business in a bucket and tossed it out the window. Sanitation, or the lack of it, didn't stop the human spirit. It just made it smellier. So if you ever feel like the world's falling apart, take heart. At least you're not dodging airborne chamber pots on your morning commute. Somewhere between the cathedral ceilings and the reeking streets of medieval Europe, a curious paradox took root. A society that believed cleanliness was next to godliness, but couldn't agree on how or where to wash off the stench of its own theology. Enter the monks, shaved heads, itchy robes, ink-stained fingers, and some of the most unexpectedly advanced latrine systems of the Middle Ages. Yes, in an era when kings relieved themselves into hallway fireplaces and peasants fertilized their fields, the old-fashioned way, it was the quiet, bookish monks who kept the torch of Roman sanitation flickering in the dark. Let's begin with the setting. A Benedictine monastery circa the 12th century. Picture stone walls thick with ivy, a courtyard echoing with Gregorian chants, and somewhere, just beyond the herb garden, a narrow stone tower humming with the quiet sound of running water. That, dear listener, is the latrine block. And yes, it had plumbing. Most monasteries were laid out with an almost obsessive eye for order. Cloisters arranged in precise quadrangles, dormitories lined with humble beds, refectories for silent meals, and adjacent to them all, the necessarium, their dignified name for the bathroom. Unlike the garderobes of castles or the outhouses of villages, these were thoughtfully engineered. Monks understood the concept of water flow, and they harnessed nearby streams to flush waste away from their holy business. Each latrine tower was usually a two-story structure, with chutes or drains carved from stone. Some were divided by thin partitions, a nod to privacy, though not always enforced. After all, modesty was a virtue, but so was humility, and nothing keeps a monk humble like hearing Brother Gregory struggle with last night's lentil stew. The entire system was based on gravity and discipline. Water was diverted through channels beneath the seats to carry away waste. Some monasteries even had their own rakers, designated monks whose job it was to maintain the chutes and ensure the divine river of refuse flowed uninterrupted. Imagine taking a vow of poverty, celibacy, and eternal plumbing duty. That's dedication. But these weren't just functional, they were symbolic. For monks, cleanliness had spiritual weight. Filth represented sin. Purity of the body mirrored purity of the soul. So hygiene wasn't just a chore, it was a form of prayer. Some rules even prescribed when and how often monks could relieve themselves. Too often, and you were indulgent. Too infrequently, and you were prideful. Balance in all things, even your bowels. And then there were the schedules. Monastic life was a clockwork ballet of bells and duties, and toilet time was no exception. Some orders allowed only 2 visits per day, once in the morning, once before bed. Emergencies? Not officially sanctioned, but we all know Brother Thomas snuck off after second vespers more than once. What's fascinating is how this order extended to cleanliness beyond the latrine. Monks bathed regularly, more so than most nobles. They laundered robes, trimmed hair, cleaned dormitories, and even used communal combs and razors. These were, admittedly, shared with a level of bacterial confidence that modern hygiene experts would find deeply upsetting, but for the time, revolution, and they recorded everything. In between copying Bibles and writing long-winded treatises on sin, monks detailed their daily lives in manuscripts that survive to this day. Some include charming marginalia, doodles of dragons, jokes about flatulence, and even a few passive-aggressive complaints about Brother Rupert's hygiene. The same hands that illuminated sacred texts also penned notes about the upkeep of latrine drains. That's range, but let's not romanticize too much. These were still medieval facilities, cold stone seats, no toilet paper. At best, a cloth, at worst, a handful of straw, and the Lord's forgiveness. And of course, monks weren't immune to disease. Monasteries, despite their best efforts, still fell victim to plagues and illness, often because their latrine outflows led to nearby fields or streams, the same ones that fed their gardens or filled their jugs. Holiness and hygiene, not as separate as you'd think. There's something profoundly human in this. These men withdrew from the chaos of the world to seek enlightenment, and yet they still had to organize who cleaned the toilets. Their lives were wrapped in ritual, silence, and spiritual yearning, but also full of practical realities, leaky pipes, shared sponges, someone inevitably missing their assigned cleaning day and pretending they didn't hear the bell. It's a reminder that no matter how lofty the pursuit, the body remains. The monastery could be a place of divine contemplation, but even divine contemplation requires a functioning drain system and a seat that doesn't freeze your thighs off in February. So the next time you're grumbling about your office bathroom, or that one co-worker who never refills the soap, consider the monks. They didn't just build libraries. They kept the lights on in the long, cold corridor of sanitation history. Quietly, faithfully, and, one would hope, with the window open. When you think of the Silk Road, your mind probably drifts to spices, silks, dazzling caravans winding through golden deserts, and suspiciously overpriced incense. What you likely don't picture is someone squatting over a hole in the ground while camels stare indifferently. But here's the thing. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway for trade. It was a corridor for culture, cuisine, disease, and yes, hygiene habits. Or in some cases, catastrophic lapses in them. Let's begin in the East. Ancient China, where public sanitation was already pulling ahead, while much of Europe was still trying to figure out how not to bathe itself into an early grave. During the Han Dynasty, rest stops known as post stations were scattered along trade routes. These weren't glamorous. You didn't get a mint on the pillow. But many had designated latrines, sometimes even with drainage pits or basic sewer systems. China, even in antiquity, took the management of human waste seriously. The Tang Dynasty, centuries later, would employ street sanitation workers, actual government employees tasked with scooping, shoveling, and relocating the city's least glamorous output. And what happened to that precious cargo? It was sold. Yes, human waste, euphemistically known as night soil, was collected and transported to farms. This wasn't seen as degrading. It was business. The Chinese had long understood the connection between fertilizer and food, and they created entire industries around it. Their toilets weren't just functional. They were productive, economically circular, and just a little bit gross. Now skip westward. Persia, the heart of the Islamic Golden Age. Here, things were positively luxurious. Islamic culture placed strong emphasis on cleanliness, both spiritual and physical. Ablution was mandatory before prayer, which happened 5 times a day, so water infrastructure had to be accessible. That extended to toilets. Many Persian homes had enclosed latrines with running water. The rules of istinja, ritual purification, after relieving oneself, made washing non-negotiable. No broken pots, no communal sponges, just water, respect, and personal dignity. Imagine that. Public bathhouses, or hammams, became the cornerstones of hygiene and social life. You'd go in for a steam, maybe a scrub, and of course, a discreet toilet tucked away in a corner. These weren't just bodily maintenance stations, they were spiritual refreshers, and after a long day bartering silk, sweating in the desert, and dodging highwaymen, a proper rinse was the closest thing to heaven. And then came the Mongols. Let's be clear, the Mongols were brilliant military tacticians and logistical masterminds. But bathroom culture was not their forte. These were nomadic people. They didn't build cities. Their idea of sanitation involved finding a patch of earth that looked less cursed than the others, and squatting. To their credit, they did have rules. You weren't supposed to go near water sources or sacred spaces, but the bath or sanitary was buried deep in the steppe and never heard from again. As the Mongol Empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe, so too did their portable hygiene standards, or lack thereof. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to relieve themselves wherever was convenient. Inside conquered cities? Sure, outside sacred temples. Why not? If there was a tree and enough privacy not to get stabbed, it qualified. So what happens when well-groomed Persian scholars, practical Chinese engineers, and free-range Mongol cavalrymen all share a continent-sized hallway? Culture shock and bacteria. Yet somehow, through all the sand, sewage, and silk bundles, information spread. The Silk Road wasn't just a physical route, it was an idea highway, and sanitation ideas did travel. Paper, for instance, the Chinese were the first to use it as toilet paper, as early as the 6th century. By the 14th century, entire factories were producing sheets, specifically for wiping. Not calligraphy, not poetry, just wiping. And while Europe was still using hay, moss, and whatever emotional trauma they had lying around, paper slowly crept west. It would take a few more centuries and the invention of the printing press, ironically, for people to really embrace the concept of disposable hygiene. But the fact remains, the Silk Road didn't just bring spices, it brought sponges, soap, ideas about plumbing, public health, and why maybe you shouldn't defecate upstream. Cliffhanger time. Which culture pioneered paper for more than just poetry? Hint, it wasn't Europe, it was China, and their innovation wiped the competition. So the next time you sit on a porcelain throne with your 3-ply tissue, remember the miles of sunburned trade caravans, the desert latrines, and the unsung sanitation workers who made history, one scoop at a time. The Renaissance, that glorious rebirth of art, science, and wildly exaggerated fashion. A time when humanity rediscovered anatomy, perspective, and the joys of painting naked cherubs on ceilings. But for all the breakthroughs in beauty, let's talk about the real Renaissance experience. Stepping out into a city that smelled like a garlic-soaked corpse fermenting in a cheese cellar. Welcome to the Renaissance of smell, where poetry blossomed but public hygiene absolutely did not. Let's paint the scene. It's Florence in the 15th century. Michelangelo is sculpting muscle-bound saints, the Medici are playing politics like a blood sport, and someone just tossed a full chamber pot out their upstairs window. It lands with a splat. Not in metaphor, but in very real, very pungent fact. That odor. That's not the meat market. That's the street itself. See, the Renaissance may have revived classical ideas, but it utterly fumbled ancient sanitation. Unlike the Romans, who had aqueducts and public sewers, Renaissance cities were often built atop crumbling infrastructure. The result: streets turned into open-air compost bins, with a daily slurry of animal entrails, human waste, spoiled food, and existential dread. And still, people dressed like royalty. You wore silks, velvet, layers upon layers of heavy brocade, because nothing says I have status like marinating yourself in wool during a midsummer sewage festival. Public toilets? Practically non-existent. In most cities, it was every but for itself. Peasants used outhouses if they had yards. Nobles used chamber pots. And everyone else, they got real familiar with alleys. If you were lucky, your building had a shared latrine, a small wooden bench with a hole that led straight to the outside wall. where waste plopped unceremoniously into a drain, or more often, the street below. Gravity, once again, doing God's dirtiest work. In Venice, entire homes sat above the canals, with waste chutes that emptied directly into the water. Romantic gondola ride. Anyone? Don't mind the floating turd. It's probably got a name and a tragic backstory. So what did people do about the smell? 2 words: cover scents. The Renaissance was an olfactory arms race. You had pomanders, little perforated balls, filled with herbs, spices and dried flowers, worn around the neck or carried in the hand. Nobles stuffed their gloves with lavender, rosemary and cloves. People lit incense in homes, churches, and even pockets. Yes, pockets. Walking around with a smouldering pouch of herbs in your doublet was considered sensible. Scented candles, try scented torches. Perfume exploded in popularity. Not as a seductive flourish, but as a survival mechanism. If your nose couldn't escape the stench, at least it could fight back. Eau de toilette was not just a clever name, it was a desperate hope. Even doctors got in on the act. The infamous plague masks with the long bird-like beaks. Not just for intimidation. Those beaks were stuffed with herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges to filter out the miasma, the bad air believed to cause disease. Never mind the lack of germ theory. People were inhaling lavender like it was medicine, because in their world, it was. And speaking of disease, the sanitation problem wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Cities were breeding grounds for typhus, dysentery, and the ever-popular bubonic plague. You'd think after a few rounds of watching your neighbors die while the streets ran brown, someone would invest in a sewer. But no. The answer was almost always more incense. Or, occasionally, a full-blown pilgrimage. In private homes, things weren't much better. Aristocratic palaces dripping with marble, tapestries and chandeliers often lacked designated bathrooms. Chamber pots were emptied into stairwells or tossed from balconies. Some homes had built-in close stools, which were essentially wooden chairs with holes and a container underneath. They were fancy, yes, but still needed emptying by a servant. Congratulations, you've invented the elegant bucket. And then there was the bizarre Renaissance medical advice about sanitation. Some physicians warned against bathing too often, claiming it opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease. So instead of washing, people powdered themselves, heavily, with chalk, crushed pearls, or lead. They became walking pastries, flaky, layered, and on the verge of collapse. Think your roommate's bathroom habits are bad? Try living above a medieval tannery. The smell of rotting animal hides, soaked in urine and lime, drifted through open windows while you tried to write love sonnets or dissect corpses for art class. Because yes, anatomy lessons were often held in the same buildings as butchery, a fragrant reminder of mortality. And yet, in all this filth, the Renaissance thrived. Art, science, poetry, the very people who couldn't keep their sidewalks clear of waste, also painted the Sistine Chapel and mapped the stars. It's almost inspiring, or at least incredibly ironic. Human resilience is a strange thing. We chase beauty in the middle of rot. We compose symphonies while rats gnaw at the floorboards. And we invent perfume, not for luxury, but for self-defense. So next time you light a candle in your clean tiled bathroom and exhale like it's a spa day, remember this. Once upon a time, someone stood in a velvet cape on a Venetian balcony, holding a pomander to their nose, while a bucket of raw sewage sailed past their head, and they still thought they were living in a golden age. Versailles, a name that conjures images of chandeliers, endless mirrors, powdered wigs, and opulent gardens, so symmetrical they could induce anxiety. It was the jewel of absolutist France, a palace so extravagantly unnecessary it may as well have screamed, "We invented money. Now watch us set it on fire." But here's what they don't put in the brochures. Versailles stank. It was less palace of dreams, and more glorified perfume-soaked outhouse. Let's peel back the gold leaf. By the late 1600s, Versailles had ballooned into a political zoo, with over 3,000 full-time residents. Nobles, servants, guards, cooks, hairdressers, and that one guy whose only job was to hold the king's candle. And yet, in all that architectural splendor, someone forgot the basics. Toilets, places to actually go. For all the palace's fountains and gilded staircases, it had astonishingly few permanent latrines. Most of the people, including nobles, resorted to chamber pots or simply found a quiet corner behind a curtain. Yes, A curtain. Versailles was built for show, not function. Every inch was designed to impress visitors and terrify rivals, not to manage bodily needs. So when the Duke of this or the Comtesse of that needed to relieve themselves during a royal reception, they'd step behind a velvet drape, do their business, and emerge with a straight face, and the quiet knowledge that the next person brushing past that curtain would be in for a deeply unpleasant surprise. And then there were the fireplaces. Oh yes, guests, in the absence of chamber pots or a handy shrub, would sometimes relieve themselves in fireplaces during winter, while lit. And we wonder why French perfumes became so aggressive. Outdoor spaces didn't fare much better. The gardens, those pristinely manicured symbols of cosmic order, were popular dumping grounds for both literal and metaphorical crap. Servants couldn't keep up with the demand. One English visitor in 1715 described the grounds as covered in filth, and noted the powerful stench that wafted through the halls when the wind shifted. Nothing says divine monarchy like the faint smell of week-old urine blowing through the Hall of Mirrors. It wasn't just nobles either. Servants lived in cramped quarters, and shared whatever facilities they could find, which was often none. Even the Queen's apartments didn't always come equipped with toilets. Marie Antoinette had to request private facilities. And even then, it was more about convenience than dignity. Imagine playing harp in a Rococo salon while someone relieves themselves 10 feet away behind a flimsy partition. It's not just undignified, it's avant-garde performance art. So why didn't anyone fix this? 2 reasons. First, plumbing was seen as vulgar. The upper classes believed bodily functions were beneath discussion, let alone visible infrastructure. Second, the palace was already built. Retrofitting it for sanitation would have been costly, disruptive, and, perhaps most damning, practical. And Versailles, above all, was not a place for practicality. It was a place where illusions reigned, cleanliness was performed, not achieved. Thus, the court developed coping mechanisms: perfume, powder, fans, satirical detachment. Nobles would douse themselves in rosewater and musk to mask the surrounding decay. Courtiers walked with scented handkerchiefs pressed subtly to their noses, and of course there were servants, an army of humans trained to sweep, scrub, and discreetly remove waste as if it had never existed. But the truth always leaked through. Quite literally, refuse built up in hidden corners. Cesspools overflowed. Chamber pots were dumped out windows. The palace relied on nightmen to carry waste out in the dead of night and dump it far away, and even they couldn't keep up. Imagine being the guy who's scrubbing marble floors under a painting of Apollo, while ankle-deep in aristocratic sewage. Now that's the real divine comedy. Still, no one talked about it. Not out loud. Cleanliness was reputation, not reality. And Versailles was built on appearances, a glittering illusion maintained by people who smelled like lavender and moral decay. What's the price of glory when your throne has no flush? The irony is hard to miss. The Sun King, Louis XIV, bathed rarely. He was proud of his godlike image, yet reportedly suffered from chronic fistulas and dental infections. His medical records are essentially a horror novel, and while he demanded daily ritual attendance for his rising, dressing, and meals, there was no official ritual for, say, hygiene. Clean hands? Yes. Clean everything else? Optional. When the French Revolution finally rolled in, angry, filthy, and ready to guillotine anyone who wore silk in the wrong tone, it wasn't just about class inequality. It was about decay. The rotting extravagance of Versailles had become symbolic of a system too bloated to flush itself. The palace still stands, of course. Tourists now wander through its fragrant history with audio guides and overpriced museum shop candles. But if walls could talk, and more importantly, if floorboards could scream, they'd tell you this: Versailles may have been the height of elegance, but beneath the wigs and wine was a stench no perfume could fully cover. Let's take a moment to appreciate the humble chamber pot, that glorified soup bowl of human necessity. For centuries it was the great leveler. Everybody, from kings to cobblers, used one. But what happened after it was used? That's where things got real stratified, real fast. Picture a 17th century European city, narrow, crooked alleys, damp timbered buildings, and the ever-present clatter of hooves over cobblestone. Beneath the surface charm lies an urban ecosystem, entirely dependent on a simple ceramic pot. And where, or more accurately, who, It emptied onto... Let's start at the top. Literally. In the grand homes of the wealthy, the chamber pot was rarely touched by its owner. It lived discreetly beneath an ornate canopied bed, or inside a gilded commode. When nature called, the lord or lady would ring a bell, do their business, and let someone else deal with the aftermath, usually a maid, sometimes a valet, occasionally someone with the unenviable title of night soil attendant, which, frankly, sounds like a job invented by your enemies. Enter our main character for today, Marguerite, 17 years old, third daughter of a laundress, newly employed in a Paris townhouse where the windows are stained glass but the morals are fogged. Her job, among other things, fetching, emptying, and cleaning the chamber pots of everyone above her on the payroll ladder, which, spoiler, is everyone. Every morning, Marguerite rises before the sun. Not for breakfast, that comes later if at all, but to begin her route, pot after pot, from the lady of the house's perfumed porcelain vessel, decorated with painted roses and a golden rim, no less, to the master's sturdier, more masculine iron basin, from the children's smaller pots, to the guest room backups, all of it carried down narrow servant stairs and emptied into the backyard pit, or, if the pit's full, discreetly into the alley. No applause, no thanks. Maybe a curt nod if she's lucky. Most days, just the smell and the weight of other people's dignity. Now swing the camera over to the working poor. Their pots, cracked earthenware, unadorned, often shared by a whole family, and maybe the neighbours too. The chamber pot was a necessity, but also a burden. No servants to haul it away. You did it yourself, often under cover of night, when no one could see the shame. Some took it to designated cesspits. Others flung the contents out the window with a quick shout of warning, Gerde law, which, roughly translated, means look out for the pea-bomb. And then there were those with no pots at all, the truly destitute. They found corners, alleys, crumbling stairwells. When you don't have a pot to piss in, quite literally you rely on shadows and luck. Yes, that infamous phrase, not a pot to piss in, wasn't just colourful language. It was a class indictment. To lack a chamber pot was to lack even the most basic control over your existence. You were below the line of sanitation, below dignity, a non-person in a society already teetering on the edge of filth. Meanwhile, in wealthier circles, chamber pots became fashion statements. Some were shaped like classical urns, others bore the family crest. A few eccentric nobles commissioned pots with portraits of political enemies painted inside the bowl, because nothing says I loathe you like urinating on someone's face 3 times a day. There's something almost tragic in that contrast. The rich turned waste into spectacle, the poor turned it into survival, and in between, people like Marguerite hauled it all in silence. To be clear, this wasn't just a French thing. In England, Italy, Spain, wherever cities clustered and plumbing lagged behind, the chamber pot was queen, and behind it, a quiet army of mostly women managed the unspeakable, so that society could keep pretending it smelled like roses. What did it mean, socially, to have someone else carry your waste away? It meant power. It meant status. It meant never having to touch the part of life that reminded you you were human. And what did it mean for the Marguerites of the world? That they were invisible, necessary, and often scorned for the very work that kept the household from collapsing into rot. It's easy to romanticize history. The candlelight, the corsets, the powdered wigs. But every ball gown hides a chamber pot. Every castle, a cesspit. The entire structure of aristocratic Europe balanced precariously on the backs of those who cleaned up after the elegance. And let's not forget the innovation. Some chamber pots came with lids for politeness. Others were built into chairs, the precursor to modern commodes. One clever design had a built-in bell, so the servant would know when it was time for a pickup. Imagine sitting on your portable toilet and ringing for service like you're ordering another round of champagne. Still think you'd enjoy time traveling to the... So next time you flush, give a brief nod to Marguerite and all those who came before her, who didn't have that luxury. They carried class systems on their backs. Literally. In ceramic pots, and they did it with bowed heads, tired arms, and a quiet understanding. Elegance always needs someone to mop up after it. While Europe was busy flinging waste from windows and convincing itself that perfume could defeat bacteria, Japan was quietly perfecting the art of poop management. Edo period Japan, to be precise. roughly 1603 to 1868, a time of samurai, shoguns, and some of the most shockingly organized sanitation practices in the pre-modern world. If you're imagining ancient Tokyo as a chaotic mess of wooden houses and questionable puddles, allow me to politely redirect you, because Edo was cleaner than your cousin's Airbnb before a 5-star review. Let's start with the basics. Toilets. The average home in Edo had a designated privy, a squat-style toilet placed over a wooden or stone-lined pit. These weren't luxurious by modern standards, but they were functional, consistent, and most importantly, part of a larger ecosystem. That pit? It wasn't just a hole, it was a storage vault for fertilizer, a resource, a commodity, human waste, or night soil. No fun was so valuable in Edo that landlords would actually charge lower rent in exchange for the right to collect their tenants' contributions. Yes, you heard that correctly. Your poop was literally rent payment. Entire businesses revolved around the collection and resale of waste. Specialized workers called funyoshi would go door to door with buckets and carts, scooping up the contents of privies and hauling them to farms on the outskirts of the city. There, the waste was composted, aged, and used to enrich rice fields and vegetable plots. It was a closed-loop system so efficient it could make modern urban planners cry into their sewer maps. And this wasn't some underground shame-ridden affair. It was regulated. City officials kept detailed records. Contracts were drawn up between landlords and farmers over waste rights. Disputes were arbitrated in court. Let that sink in. While London was inventing the Great Stink, Edo was fine-tuning a poop-based economy with legal infrastructure. But sanitation in Japan wasn't just economic. It was cultural. Cleanliness was baked into the national identity. Shintoism, one of the country's dominant belief systems, emphasized ritual purification. Dirt, especially bodily waste, wasn't just unsightly, it was spiritually polluting. So even in crowded, fire-prone wooden cities, streets were swept, water buckets were placed for emergencies, and latrines, humble though they were maintained with the kind of daily care most of us reserve for our phones. Schools taught hygiene. Bathing was frequent and communal. Even the poorest citizens took pride in keeping their surroundings clean. Shame was a powerful motivator, and cleanliness wasn't just about personal comfort. It was about social respect. You didn't want to be that guy whose privy overflowed or whose alley smelled like regret. Reputation, after all, was everything. Meanwhile, in Europe, people were inventing wigs to cover lice infestations. So, you can see the contrast. Of course, Edo wasn't flawless. Outbreaks still happened. Cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses made appearances, especially when floods contaminated water supplies. But when that happened, the response wasn't to toss a few herbs at the problem and hope for divine intervention. It was methodical. Quarantines were established, wells were checked, streets were scrubbed, and the waste collectors, they got hazard pay. Even more impressive. Japan's sanitation practices weren't just urban. Rural villages had similar systems, often adapted to local geography. Mountainside homes used gravity-powered outhouse drains. Coastal towns had tide-synchronized latrines. In snowy regions, privies were built inside to prevent frostbite in your nether regions, because no one should have to chisel through ice just to pee. Let's fast forward a bit. In the 20th century, as Japan industrialized, it didn't abandon its hygiene heritage. Quite the opposite. By the post-war era, the country had become obsessed with cleanliness. High-tech toilets, complete with bidets, heated seats, and automatic lids, became not just common, but expected. Today, stepping into a Japanese public restroom is like entering a spa designed by NASA. Buttons, music, fragrance dispensers, and yes, options for soft or powerful flushing, a choose-your-own-adventure novel, but for your behind. And yet, underneath all the tech is something ancient. A belief that how we treat waste reflects how we treat each other, that cleanliness isn't luxury. It's civic duty. Modern parallel. Japan's toilet tech still reigns supreme. Coincidence? Not at all. It's cultural momentum built over centuries. From wooden privies to smart bidets, it's one long, clean line of intentional design. So the next time you complain about a lukewarm automatic hand dryer or a gas station bathroom from hell, just remember, while the rest of the world was wallowing in filth and denial, Edo was turning poop into profit, waste into respect, and toilets into symbols of national pride. Sometimes civilization isn't measured by art or war or politics. Sometimes it's measured by who picks up the bucket and what they do with it. The Victorian era. The age of manners, morality, monocles, and massive, festering sewage disasters. On the surface, 19th century Britain looked like the picture of industrial progress, railways stretching across the land, steamships ruling the seas, and factories belching optimism into the sky. But peel back the corset, gently please, and you'll find a society drowning in its own filth, literally. This was the century that gave us Charles Dickens, Queen Victoria, and the Great Stink of 1858. An event so pungent, it practically slapped Parliament across the face and demanded, in no uncertain terms, that someone fix the plumbing. Let's set the stage. London, mid-1800s, a booming metropolis of over 2 million people, crammed into tight, soot-stained streets, rows of tenements stacked like grimy filing cabinets. Indoor plumbing? Optional. Toilet paper? Aspirational. Most homes used chamber pots or rudimentary closets that emptied into cesspools, underground pits that slowly filled with everything human bodies could produce. Out of sight, out of mind, until it wasn't. Because here's the twist. The Victorian obsession with propriety didn't extend below the floorboards. While people ironed their newspapers and held in farts for social decorum, their waste was quietly fermenting beneath their feet, and when cesspits overflowed, which they did, often, the contents seeped into basements, streets, and even drinking wells. So why not just flush it all away? Excellent question. By the 1840s, water closets, the early versions of flush toilets, were becoming fashionable among the middle and upper classes. Progress. Right? Not quite. Because all those new toilets were flushing into the same cesspools, or worse, directly into the Thames. No one had bothered to build the sewers to go with them. It was like giving everyone in town a sink and forgetting to invent the drain. Now, the Thames was more than a river. It was a symbol of national pride. It was also the city's drinking water. So when human waste started pouring into it unchecked, people noticed, not with action, heavens no, but with poetry. One satirical magazine in 1850 called the Thames a river of noble character, but somewhat too thick to be transparent. That's Victorian for, it looks like soup and smells like death. Enter the summer of a heat wave gripped the city. The sun baked the sewage-laced river into a steaming, sulphurous broth. Windows were sealed with vinegar-soaked curtains. Lawmakers draped handkerchiefs over their noses and contemplated relocating Parliament entirely. And still, no one dared call it what it was, a sanitation crisis caused by centuries of denial and a total lack of pipes. Until finally the stink became undeniable. The government scrambled to act. Committees were formed. Reports were written. And out of the olfactory carnage rose one of the unsung heroes of public health, Joseph Bazalgette, an engineer with the patience of a saint and the bladder control of a god. He designed a modern sewer system that re-rated waste away from the Thames, toward treatment plants outside the city, miles of brick-lined tunnels, pumping stations powered by steam. It was beautiful, massive, and most importantly it worked. The project took years. It cost a fortune, but it saved lives. Cholera outbreaks, once a recurring horror, declined sharply. Streets became less deadly. Drinking water cleared, and London finally stopped fermenting itself from the inside out. Reflective pause. What good is progress if it reeks? But even as Bazalgette's marvel took shape, the class divide remained. The wealthy had indoor toilets. The poor? They had shared privies, backyard pits, and outdoor closets that might or might not be emptied before they exploded. One London slum had 87 people using a single toilet. And no, it wasn't cleaned daily, or weekly, or let's just move on. And then there were the euphemisms. The Victorians were deeply uncomfortable with anything even adjacent to the bathroom. Words like toilet, leg, and underwear were considered unseemly in polite company. So instead, they talked about retiring, powdering their nose, or visiting the necessary, anything to avoid admitting they were, in fact, going to sit on a wooden hole and hope for the best. So yes, this was a society that built libraries, coded Morse, and invented anesthesia, but still needed a heat wave to realize pooping in your drinking water is a bad idea. And yet, Out of the stink rose awareness. Public health became a real, funded concern. Sanitation reforms spread to other cities. Engineers once considered mere tradesmen became heroes. Even Queen Victoria had indoor plumbing installed at Windsor Castle. Discreetly, of course. Can't have the monarch acknowledging the existence of bodily functions. So the next time you flush without fear, remember, it wasn't always this simple. It took cholera, heat, and a river that smelled like God's armpit to teach humanity that progress without plumbing is just a very expensive cesspool. Imagine navigating the bustling streets of 19th century Paris. The architecture is stunning. The perfume clings to the air like flirtation. And the cafe you just left served a coffee strong enough to inspire poetry or a desperate need to find the nearest place to pee. But here's the catch. You're in public. And in this century, that meant your options ranged from awkwardly creative to legally questionable. Welcome to the awkward adolescence of public restrooms. Before the modern world embraced the idea that humans might need to relieve themselves outside the privacy of their own homes. Urban life was a urinary gamble. You held it, found an alley, or pretended that tree had always been decorative. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was a matter of public health, social shame, and civil engineering all tangled up in one smelly knot. The French, always eager to turn necessity into spectacle, were the first to make a stylish attempt. Enter the passoire. Cast iron urinals, open on one side, with ornate scrollwork that whispered, "Sure, you're peeing, but do it with flair." Installed throughout Paris in the mid-1800s, under Napoleon III, and the urban planning genius Baron Haussmann, these urinals weren't enclosed, weren't private, and weren't subtle, but they were revolutionary. A man, yes, just men, could now relieve himself, without ducking into a doorway or traumatizing a passerby. The pissoirs dotted the boulevards, hiding users from the front, while leaving their backs and feet exposed. From the right angle, it looked like someone was just admiring the architecture while urinating directly into it. But hey, it beat the alternative. Women, of course, were not invited to this party. In fact, the design and rollout of public toilets across the Western world came with a rather glaring omission. Half the population. Authorities worried that giving women access to public restrooms would encourage them to spend time in public, which, apparently, was horrifying. So while men could pop into a pissoir on the way to the cafe, women were expected to hold it, or go home, or develop incredible bladder control and a deep relationship with kidney stones. This sparked what some historians cheekily call the urinary leash, the idea that women's movements were literally constrained by their lack of toilet access. Suffragettes didn't just fight for the vote. They also lobbied, argued, and protested for the right to relieve themselves without shame or exile. In New York, meanwhile, the public restroom revolution took a more industrial turn. As cities swelled with workers and immigrants, municipal planners realized something had to give. By the late 1800s, restrooms started appearing in parks, libraries, and train stations. They were utilitarian, tiled, and built like fallout bunkers. But they were public, and they worked, sort of. There was the small problem of cleanliness. Early public toilets quickly became infamous for their smell, their filth, and their uncanny ability to make even the most desperate visitor reconsider their priorities. Newspaper editorials called them sewers with doors. Activists decried them as breeding grounds for disease and immorality. Some people claimed they were so vile you exited less human than you entered. Enter the attendants, often elderly men in hats, armed with mops and judgmental silence. These bathroom sentinels kept order, enforced hygiene, and occasionally doled out wisdom like a urinal-based oracle. Drop a penny in the saucer, and you'd earn access to toilet paper and a fleeting sense of security. But privacy remained a luxury. Stalls were designed with gaps at the bottom, and often between panels. The reasons? Supposedly to prevent crime, speed turnover, and ensure no one passed out unnoticed. But really, it's the architectural equivalent of saying, sure, you can have privacy, just not full privacy. Not like European privacy. Cliffhanger. Who decided stalls needed gaps at the bottom? You're going to be mad. The answer? A mix of paranoia and budget cuts. Designers believed shorter doors discouraged loitering, allowed for emergency access, and most crucially saved money. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that human dignity is always negotiable when budgets get tight. Still, these awkward, imperfect restrooms marked a seismic cultural shift. Suddenly, cities acknowledged that bodily needs didn't vanish in public, that even the most upright citizen might, one day, need to sprint into a stall with the urgency of a man dodging a Baroque cannonball. And slowly, access expanded. Women's restrooms were added. Baby changing stations appeared. ADA-compliant bathrooms brought accessibility into the spotlight. The modern public bathroom, though often mocked and misunderstood, became a crucial part of urban life. It's not glamorous, it doesn't get monuments, but it matters. So next time you step into a slightly too bright stall, knees brushing the sides, feet visible to the world, and a hand dryer wheezing like a dying accordion, take a moment to appreciate the history. Because once upon a time, people had no choice but to hold it, or hide it, or accept that their entire city doubled as a toilet. And now, we have doors. Mostly. Let's talk about bathrooms. Not the tiled, air-freshened sanctuaries you find in some airports or boutique coffee shops, but the ones that come with rules. Invisible ones. Ones that remind you, subtly or not so subtly, where society thinks you belong. Because if there's one place where power, prejudice and plumbing intersect, it's the bathroom stall. To start, rewind to Jim Crow-era America. Picture a whites-only sign above a toilet door, because nothing says welcome to civilization like making sure people can't pee in the same porcelain bowl. Segregated bathrooms weren't just about hygiene. They were about control. Black Americans were told not only where to eat, sit or learn, but where and when to relieve themselves. Public facilities, including bathrooms, were used as tools of humiliation. In some southern cities, black workers were denied restroom access entirely while on the job, forced to wait until they got home if they could even make it. And don't romanticize the North too much. Many unofficial signs and policies existed there too, operating on the same principle: make basic needs difficult, and you make participation in public life difficult too. Meanwhile, gender joined the party. The first women's public restroom in the US appeared at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, and it came with an entrance fee, because apparently you had to pay for the privilege of being female and needing to urinate. Bathrooms were built with assumptions baked into their architecture. Men are fast, solitary, efficient, women are slow, communal, and apparently require couches. Early women's restrooms often had restrooms attached, lounges with fainting couches, mirrors and flower arrangements, as if using a public toilet required post-traumatic debriefing. And let's not ignore the ongoing saga of the line. Ever notice how women's restroom lines snake around corners like it's the premiere of a Taylor Swift movie, while men are in and out before you can say gender imbalance? That's not biological. That's design. Men's rooms have urinals, more compact, faster turnover. Women's rooms, stalls only, fewer of them, longer waits. Multiply that frustration across centuries, and you start to understand why some women carry that bathroom look. Part desperation, part determination, part murder in the eyes. Now let's fast forward to a more recent battleground: transgender bathroom access. For some reason, the simple act of choosing a door has become a national moral crisis. Trans people already navigating a world built on binary assumptions are met with everything from confused stares to outright bans. And here's the kicker. The so-called bathroom bills aren't really about bathrooms. They're about power, about defining who counts, about controlling public space by policing private moments. Because if you can make someone feel unsafe or unwelcome in a restroom, you can push them out of society altogether. It's not theoretical. A 2016 study showed that nearly 60% of transgender Americans avoid using public restrooms entirely out of fear. Imagine scheduling your day, your travel, your meals, your hydration around where you can safely pee. Let that sink in. Oh, and while we're talking design injustice, who decided bathroom signage should be a stick figure in a dress, and one without? It's reductive, outdated, and let's face it, ugly. And don't get me started on those creepy toddler-shaped figures on family restroom doors. We can do better. The symbolism matters. The space matters. Race, too, hasn't been flushed out of the system. Studies show that Black and Latino neighborhoods still suffer from fewer public facilities, worse maintenance, and limited access. Infrastructure, like everything else, often follows the money and ignores the margins. Now consider disabled individuals. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990. That's shockingly recent. considering wheelchairs have existed for centuries. Before ADA compliance, bathrooms were like obstacle courses, narrow stalls, no grab bars and sinks placed at eyebrow level. Even today, many accessible stalls are used as storage closets or are just awkwardly impossible to enter without some interpretive dance. And if you think this conversation is only about the West, let's zoom out. In many parts of the world, women and girls still lack access to safe, private toilets altogether. The result? Dropping out of school during menstruation, risking assault, being silenced one locked bathroom door at a time. Reflective pause. Ever waited in a women's line while the men's is empty? Multiply that frustration across centuries. But here's where things shift. More and more designers, activists, and regular old humans are saying enough. Gender-neutral bathrooms are popping up everywhere, from universities to airports. Better signage, private stalls with floor-to-ceiling doors, baby-changing tables in every restroom. Finally, because a truly modern bathroom isn't about luxury, it's about dignity, about making sure everyone, regardless of gender, race, ability, or identity, can answer nature's call without also navigating a social minefield. Next time you step into a stall, take a second to appreciate what it took to get there, and what it still takes. Because this isn't just about toilets, it's about visibility, agency, respect, and maybe, just maybe, fewer lines. Let's start with a cruel truth. Bathrooms are the last place on earth where privacy should feel like a privilege. And yet, in schools and prisons, the two places that supposedly teach us how to be members of society, bathroom time becomes a lesson in humiliation. First stop, prison. Specifically, the metal toilet bolted into the corner of a concrete box. No stall, no curtain, just a shiny reminder that you no longer own your time, your space, or even your bodily functions. Welcome to the carceral commode. Inmates live under constant surveillance. And yes, that includes while they're using the toilet. The message is subtle, but unmistakable. Your most human needs will be watched, timed, and regulated. And the toilet? It's often a sink combo, a stainless steel horror show that dispenses tepid water over a bowl that hasn't been properly cleaned since Reagan left office. If you're lucky, it flushes. If not, well, let's hope your cellmate's friendly. In solitary confinement, the situation worsens. Imagine being in a tiny room 23 hours a day, the toilet as your only fixture, your only sound. That's silence. That's not peace. That's punishment. That's the system saying even your waste isn't yours. And if you think that's bleak, let's talk about prisons in developing countries where one toilet might serve 30 people. In some places, the toilet is literally a hole in the ground, with a bucket, if it exists at all. Hygiene? Not even on the list. Dignity? Out of stock, since 50. So yes, the prison toilet is a control mechanism, a surveillance tool, a humiliation tactic, a place where freedom quite literally ends in a flush. But before you get too comfortable in your ergonomic desk chair thinking you've escaped this fate, let's head back to a place where privacy is also a joke. School. School bathrooms, aka architectural afterthoughts, are their own form of torture, especially for anyone not already at the top of the social food chain. You remember the flickering fluorescent light, the broken lock, the stall door that hangs off one hinge, inviting everyone to see you cry silently into your hoodie after third period algebra. For LGBTQ+ students, these bathrooms can become survival zones. Fear of being outed, fear of harassment, fear of using a space that doesn't match your identity, and getting reported for it. Some students hold it in for hours, even the whole day, just to avoid entering a place meant for relief, but repurposed for ridicule. And the smell. Oh, the smell. A mixture of damp paper towels, expired Axe body spray, and a subtle tang of despair. Want to know the fastest way to learn about a school's priorities? Don't look at the library, look at the bathroom. If the stalls don't have doors and the soap dispenser's been empty since Halloween, you've got your answer. Let's not forget those bathroom passes, the small laminated symbol of temporary freedom. Want to use the restroom? Better hope the teacher's not in a mood. Better hope no one else has already gone. Better hope you don't need more than 5 minutes, because some kid in 2009 vandalized a urinal and ruined it for everyone. And then there's the rise of bathroom surveillance. Cameras in hallways, bathroom monitors, time limits, biometric pass scanners in some high-tech districts. All in the name of safety, of course. But it begs the question, what are we teaching kids? That needing to pee is suspicious behavior. Reflective pause. What does a toilet say about your freedom? Now, let's blend the two. School to prison pipeline, anyone? When schools start treating kids like inmates with locked facilities, surveillance, and no trust, they're not just failing them, they're preparing them for a system that does the same thing, just with worse lighting. In both schools and prisons, the bathroom becomes a mirror, not just for checking your face, but for reflecting back what the institution thinks of you. Are you worth privacy? Worth dignity? Worth a clean, quiet space to be human? Spoiler, the answer isn't always yes, but there are glimmers. Some progressive schools are redesigning bathrooms as inclusive spaces, single-user stalls, gender-neutral signage, actual working locks. Some prisons are experimenting with rehabilitation models that treat inmates like humans first, with sanitation systems that don't double as psychological warfare. And here's where it gets personal. Everyone remembers the moment they felt vulnerable in a bathroom. Maybe it was bullying. Maybe it was identity. Maybe it was just the desperate hope no one would knock on the stall while you sobbed into a scratchy roll of toilet paper. Those memories stick because those spaces were never just about waste. They were about worth. The worst bathrooms are the ones that try to erase you. The best ones let you breathe, regroup, maybe even feel a little bit okay. So next time you flush, take a moment. Remember that for millions, that simple act is a reminder of what they've lost, or what they still don't have. Let's fast forward, past the filth, past the fumbling, past the centuries of chamber pots and public humiliation. Welcome to the future where your toilet might know more about your health than your doctor does. And yes, it can talk back. You've entered the age of toilet tech. Let's start in Japan, because of course we are. In Tokyo, walking into a bathroom can feel like stepping onto the bridge of a spaceship. Heated seats, motion sensors, bidets with pressure settings that could knock out a squirrel, and buttons. So many buttons. The modern Japanese toilet has become a throne of glorious absurdity, offering everything from ambient music to butt-specific deodorizing. This is not just sanitation. It's spa therapy for your rear end. But it's not all luxury. There's utility here. These toilets use minimal water, reduce paper waste, and are designed to support accessibility and hygiene. They aren't just showing off, they're solving problems. Quietly, with grace, and a cheerful flushing sound. Compare that to your standard public restroom in most of the Western world. You know the one, suspicious stains, toilet paper that could double as sandpaper, and an automatic flush sensor that either ghosts you mid-squat or ignores you completely. Advanced? Barely functional. Your average American toilet is still clinging to 20th century dreams, while Japanese models are practically writing poetry in Morse code. But let's go beyond smart toilets and awkward bidet introductions, because the future of flushing isn't just about comfort, it's about survival. Water scarcity is becoming a global crisis, which means flushing your waste with gallons of clean, drinkable water is starting to look a bit extravagant. Enter waterless composting toilets. These eco-friendly contraptions turn human waste into usable compost with minimal odor and no plumbing required. They're already being used in tiny homes, eco-villages, and off-grid living communities, and they work. Nature breaks it all down, literally and symbolically. But, wait, you say, clutching your phone as if it can save you. I live in a city. I don't want to compost my poop. Fair. So let's talk sensors. A new generation of smart toilets is being developed to analyze what you leave behind. No joke. These systems can detect dehydration, blood sugar irregularities, even early signs of cancer. Yep, one day your toilet might casually alert you that it's time to see a specialist, a medical assistant in porcelain form. Call it Dr. Lou. In hospitals and elder care, this tech could be a literal lifesaver, tracking trends in health data without ever asking someone to awkwardly pee in a cup again. The bathroom becomes a diagnostic lab, and weirdly it makes sense. You flush away more clues about your body's condition than you probably realize. Now let's blast off literally to the most extreme bathroom imaginable: space. On the International Space Station, every bathroom break is a feat of engineering. There's no gravity to help you out. So astronauts use vacuum suction and thigh straps just to stay in place. Urine is collected, purified, and turned back into drinking water. Waste is compressed and stored until it can be burned up in Earth's atmosphere. That's right, your poop becomes a shooting star. It's absurd. It's inspiring. It's the ultimate reminder that no matter how far we go, the call of nature follows. And speaking of the future, how about toilets designed for humanitarian crises? The Gates Foundation, among others, has funded initiatives to create low-cost, self-contained toilets that operate without water or sewer lines, ideal for refugee camps, disaster zones, or urban slums. These models disinfect waste, neutralize pathogens, and even generate energy, because sanitation isn't just a luxury, it's a human right, and innovation doesn't have to be gold-plated to be revolutionary. Reflective pause. What if the most advanced technology isn't the one that massages your rear, but the one that keeps a child alive? There's an uncomfortable irony here. As we obsess over bathroom Bluetooth and rear-end aromatherapy, billions of people still live without access to basic toilets. Diarrhea remains a leading cause of death in children under 5, not because we can't solve the problem, but because we haven't prioritized it. So maybe the future of flushing isn't just about gadgets and gizmos. Maybe it's about values. Maybe the real revolution isn't your toilet singing lullabies. It's making sure everyone everywhere gets to sit in peace, in safety, with dignity. Still, there's something comforting in knowing we're trying. That engineers are out there designing better toilets, and not just for profit. That sanitation is finally getting its glow up. That someday perhaps we'll flush with pride, and not shame. Final thought. We've come a long way since the pit latrines of Harappa. The question isn't whether toilets will keep evolving, it's whether we'll let everyone come along for the ride. Let's take a breath. A deep one. Through your nose, hopefully. Because now that we've journeyed from Harappan sewer grids to vacuum-powered space toilets, it's time to ask the question we've been quietly skirting around. What do all these toilets, from holes in the ground to gold-plated bidets, actually say about us? Because they do say something. In fact, they scream. Toilets, at their core, are the most democratic invention humanity ever created, and the most tyrannical. They reflect everything: your wealth, your culture, your fear of germs, your trust in government, your sense of shame, your dignity. Sometimes, even your religion. There's a reason some of the world's oldest laws, like the Code of Hammurabi, include rules about where you can do your business. Apparently, even 4,000 years ago, someone was already yelling, "Hey, not next to the grain storage." Let's start personal. Ever felt embarrassed asking for a public bathroom? That quiet shame? It's baked into society. The idea that natural bodily functions are somehow impied. We spend billions pretending we don't poop, and even more pretending our bodies are flawless machines that never smell, leak, or gurgle at the wrong moment. But behind every perfume spritz and automatic flush is the ancient truth. We're still just humans managing waste. And yet, there's something tender about that. Universal. The Emperor of China, the Pharaoh of Egypt, a Roman general, a Victorian maid, a child in a refugee camp. Every single one of them had to go. There's no crown heavy enough to stop the grumble of an upset stomach. No fortune strong enough to stave off food poisoning. Toilets are the great equalizer, a humbling reminder that we are all, despite our posturing, incredibly squishy animals who occasionally eat bad oysters. But toilets are more than humbling. They're aspirational. When a civilization gets around to building plumbing, you know they're getting serious. The Indus Valley used complex drainage to protect their cities from disease. The Romans engineered aqueducts because they believed in public hygiene and spectacle. Medieval monks rerouted streams to build latrine towers. The Japanese built entire sanitation economies around community health. Even in disaster zones, one of the first questions is, where will people go to the bathroom? Because where waste goes, civilization follows. Toilets also expose our values, sometimes beautifully, sometimes horrifically. Segregated bathrooms in the US didn't just separate waste, they separated people. Gendered bathroom signs became battlefields for identity. Even now, access to safe, clean toilets is a frontline issue in refugee camps, low-income housing, and rural communities. Where you poop, and how safely, can still determine how long you live. Let that sink in. And yet, we rarely think about toilets at all. That's the final irony. These devices, these smelly, often ignored portals of dignity and disease control, are treated like background noise. We don't honor the plumber the way we honor the surgeon. We don't romanticize sanitation like we do space travel. And we certainly don't put latrines in museums, unless they're gilded or ancient. But maybe we should, because toilets are civilization. They're healthcare, infrastructure, public safety, and, weirdly, peace of mind. They're the quiet, often ceramic guardians of everything we pretend we've evolved beyond. Take a moment. Picture every toilet you've ever used. The cracked ones in roadside gas stations, the gleaming ones in hotel lobbies, the freezing cold outhouses at camp, the ones in grandma's house with the floral seat cover, the terrifying ones at music festivals where the floor squelched and your soul left your body. Every one of them a story, a place where, if only for a minute, you were still human, vulnerable, alive. And that's the strange beauty of it all. This entire story, this long, strange journey through millennia of flushing and fumbling, was never just about toilets. It was about people, about us, our fears, our pride, our progress, about how something as seemingly gross and mundane as waste tells the most human story of all. Because history isn't only written in gold or carved in stone. Sometimes, it's scratched into a brick toilet in Harappa, etched into a graffiti-covered stall in New York, flushed quietly in a back alley restroom you'll never think about again. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some things aren't meant to be remembered with trumpets and fanfare. Maybe the most human things, the truest things, are the ones we do in silence, alone, with the door locked, and hopefully, enough toilet paper. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you're now officially fluent in toilet history. That's more than most emperors could say. So if you enjoyed this strange, stinky, surprisingly soulful dive through time, hit subscribe. It helps more than you know, like plumbing. Invisible, essential, and slightly underappreciated.